Hello. In this video, I'm going to be comparing Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology. See, there's a glare on there, by Ray Kurzweil, to my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. So the reason I wanted to put this video out, which is correlated to a paper that I put out on academia.edu, is because Ray Kurzweil just put out his second edition of The Singularity is Near. It's called The Singularity is Nearer When We Merge with AI. So I like Kurzweil's book because it is so similar to my book, and yet in an opposite way, because Ray Kurzweil believes that the universe is evolving towards the absolute conception of an infinitely powerful, and infinitely beautiful, infinitely loving God. And he says the way that we are going to achieve that, which he calls the historical singularity, that epoch of evolution, is when humans merge our brains with artificial intelligence. That's the first step of this historical singularity. And that, he says, will occur around 2045. And then, about a century later, he says, we'll be able to download our AI-enhanced consciousness into a black hole that has been optimized into the ultimate computer. And he cites Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory to explain his cosmology. And in my book, I compare Carl Jung's archetypal psychology to Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory to argue that each psyche is already one with the omnicentric gravitational singularity in the center of every black hole, including the inside-out black hole universe. That's what Susskind calls our universe, an inside-out black hole expanding from a singularity rather than contracting into a singularity. So I'm saying we are already one with the cosmos, which is something Carl Jung experienced during his near-death experience in 1944. He felt himself merged with the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe out at the horizon of the cosmos. And he said it seemed to him, after he came out of his near-death experience, that each of us is imprisoned in our own little three-dimensional box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. That's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. That's his autobiography, which he put out, which he had published a year after he died. So it was published in 1962. So that is very similar to Leonard Suskind's. So Leonard Susskind demonstrated that the past, the present, and the future of every bit of information of the three-dimensional volume of the universe is conserved at each point of this two-dimensional sphere of the universe, the horizon of the cosmos, which is defined as the point from our geocentric perspective on Earth, where space-time is expanding away from us in every direction at the speed of light. The past, the present, and the future are at each point of this encompassing sphere like a holographic film, says Susskind. And it radiates back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang, on these fundamental elastic strings of energy to create what he calls the cinematic hologram of three-dimensional space evolving over time. All right, so that's very important. Also, another fundamental point that I make in my book and in the paper, which I wrote about Kurzweil's book, comparing it to mine, is that according to what is called Carl Jung's leap day, what I call his leap day letter. So February 29, 1952, he wrote a letter to J.R. Smithies asking or speculating about why it is that we cannot measure psychic energy. So his point was, and he learned about relativity theory from Einstein himself over dinner conversations from 1909 to 1913 in Switzerland. E equals mc squared, that's Einstein's iconic equation. Energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. The units of mass can be converted to the units of energy if you multiply the units of mass by the speed of light squared. So the speed of light times the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second times itself. You take that number and multiply it by whatever units of mass you're dealing with, then that's how many units of energy you'll get. So an enormous amount of energy is located in each tiny speck of matter. So what Jung was wondering is, if the psyche is its own thing, if it's not a material byproduct, if it's not an emergent phenomenon from material processes, if it's its own eternal thing, it should have mass, because energy equals mass. Why can't we measure psychic energy? And he speculated it's because ultimately it's infinitely intense and it's condensed. It's in the smallest space. So the final conclusion of the letter was psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. The highest intensity of energy is infinite intensity or infinite density. The wavelengths get compacted to a point. Infinite density in a point of zero volume. So the highest intensity is infinite density. The smallest space is a point of zero volume. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So I translate Jung's equation as psyche equals singularity. So this is the point. Kurzweil says, at the historical singularity, we will saturate the universe with our consciousness. We'll transform the dumb matter into smart matter that obeys our psychic instructions, and the whole universe will be alive. It will wake up, he says. This is the sixth epoch of evolution. He says there's 6 epochs of evolution, which I'll read. I'll look at the paper that I wrote. The title of the paper up on academia.edu is Kurzweil's Historical Singularity, Hegel's End of History, Jung's Psyche equals Singularity equation and NDE, and Plato's Philosopher King. So that's a long title, but I chose that title specifically because I tie those 4 points together. So I'll briefly go over what I discuss in that paper. I told myself that I was going to start with a reading from a quote from Ray Kurzweil. So this is the one that really makes it easy to correlate him with Hegel. So he calls himself a patternist. I'm going to read here from my paper. Regarding his call to transcend biology, Kurzweil says, quote, although I have been called a materialist, I regard myself as a patternist. It is through the emergent powers of the pattern that we transcend. Since the material stuff of which we are made turns over quickly, it is the transcendent power of our pattern that persists. So, for example, the pattern of DNA, that's what structures the body. That structure, that geometric structure of our DNA persists throughout our life, but the matter of which each DNA molecule is made is constantly changing. So the material stream of disconnected particles is flowing through us constantly, and we're never the same from one moment to the next. Like Heraclitus said, you can't jump into the same river twice. But that rapid flux of disconnected particles of matter are organized by a continuously existing pattern. So that's what he's saying. So continuing here, according to Kurzweil, the patterns of information that describe who we are can be downloaded from our biological brains into any suitable substrate, which can then be merged with the godlike power of AI, which finally can be downloaded into the ultimate computer of a black hole and dispersed throughout the universe in the culminating phase of the historical singularity. So here is what Kurzweil says, and this is what is so easy to correlate to Hegel. Here's Kurzweil. He says, so in a sense, we can say that the singularity will ultimately infuse the universe with spirit. Evolution moves toward greater complexity, greater elegance, greater knowledge, greater intelligence, greater beauty, greater creativity, and greater levels of subtle attributes such as love. In every monotheistic tradition, God is likewise described as all of these qualities, only without any limitation. Infinite knowledge, infinite intelligence, infinite beauty, infinite creativity, infinite love, and so on. Of course, even the accelerating growth of evolution never achieves an infinite level, but as it explodes exponentially, it certainly moves rapidly in that direction. So evolution moves inexorably toward this conception of God, although never quite reaching this ideal. We can regard, therefore, the freeing of our thinking from the severe limitations of its biological form to be an essentially spiritual undertaking. So let me read that last couple of sentences. So evolution moves inexorably toward this conception of God, although never quite reaching this ideal. Evolution moves inexorably toward this conception of God. That's what Hegel says, that history is drawn by God's reason toward what is equivalent to Kurzweil's idea of the historical singularity. It's often referred to as the end of history, the goal of history. God has a goal for history, and God allures history, specifically the history of human beings as they organize themselves into nations towards this specific goal, which is a realization of the unity of nature and spirit, the material world and the world of consciousness, in the absolute idea emanating from God. So we'll go over that. That'll make more sense later. But Kurzweil says evolution is drawn toward this conception of God, this conception of the infinitely powerful God, but he says it never can achieve it because there's no such thing as infinity. He wavers on that a little bit because he says if there is a multiverse, then maybe there's an infinite number of universes. But that point of denying infinity is important because he denies that there actually is a point of infinite density, which is a huge point because I am equating, based on Carl Jung's leap day equation, I am equating the psyche with a point of infinite density. So let me read here on this paper. This is on page 24 of the paper. In conclusion, Kurzweil foresees the human species merging with AI to evolve into an exponentially improving approximation of the concept of an infinitely powerful God, which culminates at the historical singularity when the dumb matter of the cosmos awakens with our superhuman consciousness after we download it into the ultimate computer of a black hole. Alternatively, in line with Plato, Jung, and Hegel, I foresee us using AI to awaken ourselves through education to the fact that we are already and eternally one with, and yet autonomously distinct from God, and therefore all the cosmos, because we are already one with and different from the omnicentric singularity that exists in the center of every black hole, as well as at the omnicentric origin of the universe, and at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. Okay, so here is the major point of disagreement between Kurzweil and me, but as an introduction to that, I quote from Carl Jung's On the Nature of the Psyche, where he says that the frontiers of physics and psychology both extend into an incomprehensible zone in which he postulates a point where psyche and matter meet and do not meet. And here's the quote from Carl Jung. Our present knowledge does not allow us to do much more than compare the relation of the psychic to the material world with two cones whose apices, in a point without extension, a real 0 point, touch and do not touch. So I say similarly, the psyche equals singularity equation is a real 0 point where my book and Kurzweil's touch and do not touch, mainly because he rejects the literal existence of a point of infinite density. So what Kurzweil says, and he's following Stephen Hawking on this, he says, here's a quote from his book, because of quantum uncertainty, there is no actual point of infinite density. So in my book, I discussed this at length because Leonard Susskind was responding to Stephen Hawking about the issue of information conservation in black holes. So black holes are defined by the point of infinite density in their center. That is what Karl Schwarzschild's solution, his first exact solution to Einstein's approximate solution to the gravitational field equations in 1915, his theory of gravity, the first exact mathematical description of that implies that if enough mass was condensed into a small enough space, and the ratio is called the Schwarzschild radius, it would collapse into a point of infinite density. The mathematics of general relativity clearly predict that, and we know black holes do in fact exist. But what Hawking was saying, and others follow in saying, like Kurzweil, is that at the quantum level, a point of infinite density wouldn't exist in a definite state. It would be a wave of probability. Okay, well, there's some problems with that, claiming that as your ultimate evidence. For one, general relativity and quantum mechanics, both of them are incomplete theories because you can't use general relativity to describe the world at the quantum scale. And you can't use quantum mechanics to describe the world at the large scales where gravity is in charge, that are described by general relativity. There's one cosmos. You should have one law of physics that works all the way up and all the way down, but we don't have that. So the fact that quantum mechanics seems to indicate, according to Hawking and Kurzweil and others, that there's no such thing as a point of infinite density, well, we know that that's a partial theory. Holographic string theory, developed by Leonard Susskind and his partner Gerard 't Hooft, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist from the Netherlands, and Leonard Suskind's now retired from Stanford University. They did unite mathematically, general relativity and quantum mechanics, to describe that point where you need to use both, and that's a gravitational singularity. It's a point of infinite densities and therefore infinite gravity, so you need general relativity, and yet it's a point. It's a mathematical point of zero volume. It's the smallest thing imaginable, and that's the realm of quantum mechanics. So they work together mathematically in holographic string theory. It can't be empirically tested because the strings of string theory are down at the Planck scale, 10 to the negative 33 centimeters. I've heard other numbers be too small for current technology to detect. You cannot create the wavelengths of energy that are tightly packed enough to see something that small. It would require an atomic accelerator the size of the galaxy and 1 million barrels of oil a second to fuel it to create wavelengths that small. That's Susskind's metaphor. So I say there is a point of infinite density, and it is the soul. It's the psyche. That's what we are. So Kurzweil's idea of the historical singularity is when we permeate the universe with our consciousness after downloading it into a black hole. And I'm saying we already are downloaded into a black hole because we are one with this omnicentric singularity. Now, how can there be many singularities and yet we're all one? This has to do with the laws of physics, and what's called Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. I'll start with that one first. And this was pointed out by a philosophy professor and a mathematician, Robert Bruce Ware, who was comparing gravitational singularities to Hegel's concept of the absolute idea. So he said a point of infinite density is, all right, so Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles says that if you cannot discern a difference between two things, they are identical. So Ware said a gravitational singularity is a point of infinite density. A mathematical point has no structure, so you can't differentiate one from another based on its structure. Well, they do appear in different points of space-time, so therefore they're different. Ware says their gravitational effects appear at different points of space-time, but each singularity itself is outside of space-time. First of all, it has zero extension in space, so it's not in space. If it's not in space, how can it be in time? Furthermore, according to the physics involved, a point of infinite gravity is equivalent to a point traveling infinitely fast. And in special relativity, which Einstein established in 1905, it says the faster something goes, the faster it goes through space, the slower it goes through time. At the speed of light, time stops for an object traveling at the speed of light. It also gets contracted in the direction of travel, and it would have zero volume in space and time would stop. So if we're all gravitational singularities, we are all indistinguishably one from that perspective. You can't discern one from another based on the structure, and you can't discern one from the other based on its location in space-time. Subjectively, we have differences. So it's in some inconceivable way we're simultaneously one with and different from each other and all the cosmos. And I call the God archetype, or what Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, his intellectual partner, the Nobel Prize-winning co-founder of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. So Jung and Pauli worked closely together. So they talked about the ultimate ground of being. They called it the archetype of the self. And so what I say is that the archetype of the self is the gravitational singularity that perceives through every other singularity's perspective simultaneously. It distills all other gravitational singularities' subjective experiences into a unique subjective experience of its own. Each of us, subsidiary selves, only perceives our own unique subjective point of view, but the God archetype perceives everyone's subjective point of view simultaneously. And that's why that's the God archetype. So for Hegel, history is guided by this God archetype, by God. He doesn't call it the God archetype. He says this is God, and God manifests in different ways. And one of the original manifestation of God is the idea, the absolute idea, which is very similar to Plato's idea of the good, which we'll talk about. Then the absolute idea emanates into two more manifestations, first nature and then spirit. And history is spirit trying to reunite with nature in a realization of the unity of nature and spirit in the absolute idea of God. And the way Hegel defines spirit and the absolute idea is indistinguishable from the definition of a gravitational singularity. The way he describes spirit is equivalent to a singularity inside a black hole, and the way he describes the absolute idea is equivalent to the singularity of the omnicentric Big Bang. So the big parallel between Hegel and Kurzweil is they both say that the evolution of the universe is teleologically pulled towards this absolute conception of the infinite God. Hegel believes that God is infinitely powerful. He says it directly. God's reason has infinite power. So you think God isn't capable of pulling off his world historical plan? He is. Kurzweil says no, there is no absolute supreme God, but there's this conception of God that draws history toward it, and it advances towards that idea of the infinitely perfect God at an exponentially accelerating rate. This is one of Kurzweil's big points. He says you can't think about the progress of evolution specifically as it emerges in the evolution of human technology and the merger of human technology with our brains. You can't measure that growth rate linearly. You have to take into account the exponential growth rate. And after what he calls the knee of the curve, that exponential rate appears to take an explosive vertical takeoff. That at first, exponential growth doesn't seem that much different from linear growth, but as it advances, eventually it hits this knee of the curve and it just takes off. And that we are on the cusp of right now. So he wrote The Singularity is Near in 2005, and he just put out The Singularity is Nearer. It came out on June 25th. And so he says, we're getting ready we're on the last mile towards this historical singularity, the beginning of the historical singularity in 2045, when we merge our brains with AI. Okay, so I want to now go over some of the details. So I went over the basics of my Psyche equals Singularity interpretation of Jung's Leap Day letter. I went over the basics of his near-death experience. And we are, therefore, I'm saying, based on those parallels between Carl Jung's near-death experience and Susskind's holographic string theory, it indicates we are all one with this omnicentric singularity that exists at the central point of the universe and at each point of this encompassing sphere of the cosmos. And that's an important point. How can the central point be identical with this enormous encompassing sphere of the universe? I'm saying that point is located at each point of this encompassing sphere. According to Susskind, it's an infinitely hot, from our geocentric perspective. The horizon of the cosmos is where space-time is expanding away from us at the speed of light. It's infinitely hot, and each point contains every bit of information from the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe, and projects it back in from there with the background radiation, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang. So if it contains every bit of information from the entire temporal trajectory of the universe, it's a singularity. So this omnicentric singularity. Another way the singularity is omnicentric is no matter where you go as a physically embodied being in the universe, you will always perceive yourself to be the center away from which the universe is expanding. So the horizon of the cosmos, from our perspective on Earth, seems like this infinitely hot sphere. But from the perspective of people on a planet out there, they would be in the center of the universe, and we on Earth would be at this smeared out around this infinitely energetic horizon of the cosmos. So those are just some of the basics of my theory, which I write about in Psyche and Singularity. And now I want to get into some of the details, and I'm going to go to Hegel, because I think that's one of the more interesting parallels here. I think they're all interesting, but for me, this parallel with Hegel is especially cool, the way that it works out. I'm saying it's evidence in favor of Carl Jung's theory that we're all consciously being motivated by these collective unconscious archetypes. And I'm saying Kurzweil's idea of the historical singularity, which he's presenting atheistically, he says we will become God, basically. I am saying that idea of his is being unconsciously organized for him by this underlying idea of God, by the archetype of God, by the self-archetype. And the same goes for Leonard Susskind. who describe the megaverse of bubble universes with the singularity in the center of each and information conservation in the horizon of them all, the parallel between his theory and Carl Jung's near-death experience is a perfect point-for-point mirror symmetry, and it fulfilled the prediction first made by Plato in the Republic, and then picked up by Jung and Pauli. Jung and Pauli equated Carl Jung's theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious with Plato's theory of the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. I know I'm skipping around a bit, but I need to lay some groundwork to explain Hegel here for a second. So Plato had a strange theory that he said every temporary material form that you see, here's a book, here's my body, anything that you can perceive is like a shadow projected from some perfect absolute eternal idea of that thing. And all of those ideas are specifically located at the spherical horizon of the cosmos. He spells that out especially in the Timaeus and the Phaedrus, as well as the near-death experience at the end of the Republic called the myth of which is very similar to Carl Jung's near-death experience, and it even includes the idea of these threads of destiny attaching each soul to the horizon of the cosmos by the three fates, the singing sister goddesses who represent the past, the present, and the future, and then they come back to the central earth. So this archetype seems to be forming the worldview of our great philosophers from Plato, and then Hegel, we'll see. Carl Jung's near-death experience is very vivid. Leonard Susskind came up with the same idea, and Kurzweil bases his idea of the historical singularity on the cosmological framework provided by Susskind. So I am saying all of these worldviews have been pulled, including my own, have been pulled toward their conclusions by this underlying archetype of the good, or the absolute idea, or just God, the self, the supreme source of cosmos and psyche. What Plato said in the Republic, and what Pauli and Jung reiterated, is that the material world is a projection from the eternal forms of the spiritual world. And one way that you can learn that is by seeing a mirror reflection between the mathematical forms that describe the temporary forms of matter and the absolute ideas, or the eternal forms imprinted on the soul, including the soul of the universe, which exists in the central point and at each point of the encompassing sphere. That was spelled out especially in the Timaeus. So there's a mirror symmetry between the mathematical laws of physics and the archetypal laws of psychology. That's what Jung and Pauli later said. And here you have the pioneer at the summit of the field of psychology, Carl Jung, the student of Freud, who broke away from Freud to develop his own much deeper understanding of the psyche, in my opinion. And then you have Wolfgang Pauli, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, one of the three physicists who discovered or established the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the standard model of quantum mechanics. So he's at the peak of his field of physics. So the two leaders, or among the leaders, near the very tippity top of the fields of psychology and physics, both put their heads together and said, we should predict that as psychology and physics evolve, a mirror symmetry between them should emerge more and more clearly, because mind and matter, cosmos and psyche, both emerge from the same underlying archetypes of the collective unconscious, the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, which is out at the horizon of the cosmos and in the central point. And I am saying that that prediction was resoundingly, not in a scientific method, nothing's ever proven conclusively because evidence can always come later to disprove it, but it gains enormous support from the parallel between Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory and Carl Jung's near-death experience. And many other parallels, but that one's the most vivid and indicates that each of us is one with the entire cosmos, which means that Kurzweil's idea of the historical singularity is already a fact, but it needs to be brought to consciousness. And what I'm going to say is that you cannot create consciousness. It's eternal. It's a gravitational singularity. But his idea of merging brains with AI, now that's probably possible. There's a difference between consciousness and intelligence. Intelligence can be created artificially. Consciousness cannot be. So if you merge your brain with artificial intelligence, I am arguing, that could help you see these mirror symmetries between the mathematical laws of physics and the archetypal laws of psychology. And that, according to Socrates in the Republic, to study these mirror symmetries in the divided line analogy and the cave allegory, he says, could open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, the infinitely brilliant source of cosmos and psyche. So I'm saying to bring this unity, the knowledge of the unity of the psyche with the cosmos to consciousness, to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, AI can help us study these parallels between psychology and physics. And I'm saying that's where it should be used as an educational device that's adapted to the special learning needs of each individual student. And that could accelerate the process of developing philosopher kings, enlightened administrators who would be required, I'm saying, to run a society where AI is starting to take over. Kurzweil and others also signed this statement on AI risk that says that we should take the risk of extinction from AI as seriously as other global threats like nuclear war and pandemics. So I'm saying, all right, we should study and develop a curriculum using AI to help open enlightened administrators' minds to this unity of cosmos and psyche. And then only, says Socrates, after having seen the idea of the good, will they be able to act justly in their private lives and in public life. Okay. Then I'm saying, all right, I don't advocate it necessarily, and I am wary of it, but just speculating in a worst case scenario, if AI did start getting so intelligent that our species' survival was at risk, as these people in the leading positions of the AI field are telling us, then maybe we would be forced, just as a mere matter of survival, to merge our brains with AI to fight back. For example, in the movie The Matrix, that's what they do. They plug their brains, the organic living beings who are fighting against enslavement of the artificial intelligence that's making everybody live in a virtual reality and fooling them into thinking it's reality. They download programs into their brains and learn things like how to fly a helicopter, or, for example, after downloading this information into the socket in the back of his skull, the lead character Neo says, I know Kung Fu. So he learns Kung Fu, which takes years and years of discipline and practice to, he learns it in a few minutes. This is what Kurzweil is talking about. He's saying this is possible. So I'm saying, okay, hypothetically, if it is possible, and it probably is to some degree, then if you applied Plato's curriculum for developing a philosopher king, that could potentially harness this enormous acceleration of the human thought processes to the level of a computer. And you might be able to really start having fireworks displays of people's eye of the souls opening to the idea of the good everywhere. There's some problems that come with that. For example, you develop this intellectual vision, but you haven't developed the moral virtue required to handle that kind of intense energy. All right. So I was just kind of creating a framework there, but I want to go back to what I was trying to do, and that is go over this part with Hegel. All right, so I'm just going to read from the paper to help me get through this. This on the paper, which again is called Kurzweil's Historical Singularity, Hegel's End of History, Jung's Psyche equals Singularity Equation, and NDE, and Plato's Philosopher King. I think by now in this video, you should understand why that's the title. So moving on to the second point of my response to Kurzweil. So I have 4 points. This is the second one. The first one was Psyche equals Singularity, and Jung's NDE imply we're already one with the cosmos. We've already achieved the historical singularity. We just need to become conscious of it. So moving on to the second point of my response to Kurzweil, I argue that there is a clearly discernible parallel between his universal vision of the evolutionary process leading from the singularity of the Big Bang to the historical singularity, and Hegel's understanding of the evolution of the universe away from and back to the absolute idea. Kurzweil describes 6 epochs of evolution of patterns of information in the universe, which he categorizes as follows. So epochs 1 through 6. The first is physics and chemistry, then biology, then brains, then technology, then merger of technology and human intelligence, and the universe wakes up. So at first, there's just empty space and particles floating around. Physics and chemistry can describe that. Then the particles combine, he's following the Darwinian timeline, into self-replicating life, DNA, and there's biology. Then the rudimentary single-celled organisms evolve into creatures with brains. That's the third epoch. And then comes the humans, who have powerful brains and thumbs that can move around and create objects of technology. And that's the epoch we're in now. We're just on the cusp of the fifth epoch, the merger of technology and human intelligence. And when that kicks in, which he believes will be around 2045, that's the beginning of the historical singularity. And then about a century later, the universe wakes up when we download our AI-enhanced consciousness into a computerized black hole. Okay, so continuing with this comparison with Hegel, Kurzweil predicts that, quote, the singularity will begin with the fifth epoch. It will result from the merger of the vast knowledge embedded in our own brains with the vastly greater capacity, speed, and knowledge sharing ability of our technology. The historical singularity culminates in epoch 6. This is me writing when, and now here's the universe wakes up as humans exponentially approximate, but never quite achieve, the monotheistic idea of the infinitely powerful and all-pervasive God by infusing the holographic universe and possibly the multiverse with our AI-enhanced superconsciousness after downloading it into a computerized black hole. So I'm reading here from my paper. Following a parallel plotline almost 2 centuries earlier, Hegel describes how the absolute idea emanating from God, which I'm saying is equivalent to the singularity at the Big Bang, bifurcates first into nature and then into spirit. In Lectures on the Philosophy of History, which consists of a compilation of his own notes from lectures he gave in 1822, 1828, and 1830, it was his notes and students' notes. They compiled it into 3 editions of this book, Lectures on the Philosophy of History. Hegel explains that the human materially embodied manifestation of spirit reunites nature with the absolute idea simply by becoming fully conscious of it. So there's the absolute idea. There's God. The God has an absolute idea of everything that exists and the perfect harmony with which everything fits together. God sees the past, the present, and the future perfectly combined in this absolute idea of God's. That idea then manifests as 2 more manifestations, beginning with nature, and that's the idea exteriorizing itself. It's the opposite of idea. The idea is the consciousness of the past, present, and future of everything. Matter is unconscious. It still contains a connection with consciousness because it emanates from the absolute idea, but it has no self-realization. It has no consciousness of its consciousness. It's got a rudimentary consciousness at best, but it becomes fully conscious when nature then, from nature, the eternal spirit manifests, and a part of that absolute spirit of God manifests as the human spirit. And in the human beings, you have the union of nature and spirit. We have material bodies, and yet we have self-reflective consciousness. Animals have consciousness. They're very aware. Anyone who has a dog knows that dogs are very conscious. They're tuned into the emotional sensibilities. They're smart. They know what's going on. But it seems that they don't turn their consciousness back on itself. They never stop and are amazed at the fact that they are aware of things. They don't have self-reflection. Human beings do. And that gives us a connection with infinity, like 2 mirrors facing each other. You see, it goes off into infinity. So I'm just going to continue to read here. All right, so when we become conscious of the fact that we're one with the absolute idea, all of nature becomes awakened, according to Hegel's interpretation, and this manifests as a nation. So human beings combine themselves into nations, and then God's spirit, through the human spirit, draws the history of these nations towards a realization of the unity of nature and spirit in the absolute idea of God. And that nation is built on that knowledge. It takes a long historical progression to have a complete cultural understanding of the unity of nature and spirit. And I am saying that is occurring now, especially with the synthesis of Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory, which is presented atheistically, and Carl Jung's archetypal psychology. And that brings us full circle back around to Plato, with all the fruits of the academic tradition that began with Plato in 387 BCE. Kurzweil's book, I'm saying kind of helps as an intermediary step away from Susskind's atheistic presentation of his theory. In his own YouTube interviews, he claims to be an agnostic, but in his books, not Cosmos and Psyche, The Cosmic Landscape, String Theory and the Illusion of Intelligent Design, that was his first big book. The subtitle right there is very atheistic, The Illusion of Intelligent Design, and that's another important parallel with Kurzweil's book. And The Black Hole War, My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics. He presents those atheistically. So Kurzweil is this quasi-spiritual, quasi-theistic. He says there's no God, and yet the idea of God draws history inexorably toward it, and the universe will wake up. Now, Susskind says nothing of the sort, although his theory provides the perfect platform for describing how that might be the case, because he says all of the information of the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe is located at each point of this encompassing sphere. It's a memory bank. Add consciousness to it, and you've got everything Hegel and Plato and Jung were talking about, and I'm saying that that is how it is, and that Susskind, despite his atheistic intentions, fulfilled Plato and Jung's theory that a mirror symmetry between physics and psychology would emerge. Okay, so continuing here with Hegel, I'm saying he explains that the human materially embodied manifestation of spirit reunites nature with the absolute idea simply by becoming fully conscious of it. However, that simple realization requires a painful world historical process of complex cultural evolution, which began, for all intents and purposes, according to Hegel, with Plato's literary reenactment of Socrates in the dialogues. Lured teleologically across the slaughter bench of world history, so that's a quote from Hegel, the slaughter bench of world history, toward awareness of this absolute idea by the infinite and cunning power of God's reason, the human species divides into nations that evolve in such a way that each successive nation of world historical predominance struggles to embody a predetermined, logically discernible stage of the development of the key concept of freedom, culminating at the end of history with the concrete reunion of nature and spirit in the all-pervasive idea by way of the establishment of a nation based on and shaped by an acute, culturally sophisticated consciousness of that original unity. So what we're going over, I am saying, is this end game of the end of history. That holographic string theory and its parallels with Carl Jung's archetypal psychology brings us back, has brought us back to Plato. We have the philosophical knowledge now. We're at that point of history where the knowledge of the unity of nature and spirit and the absolute idea of God is here. We have it. I'm saying it's condensed in Carl Jung's leap day equation, which can be translated faithfully as Psyche equals singularity. That marks the philosophical realization of the end of history. I know that's a big claim to make, and I am making it. I invite others to critique it, but I think it all adds up very nicely. So continuing here with this paper, I say, realizing that we are all absolute parts and parcels of the absolute idea of God, from whom nature and spirit radiate, and in whom they reunite as one, makes us realize that we are all inherently worthy of self-determining freedom and respect. So freedom, says Hegel, is the goal of history. But he defines freedom as simply self-realization of our unity with the absolute idea. And he defines the absolute idea and spirit in a way that is indistinguishable from a gravitational singularity. It's fascinating the way he does it, and we're about to get into that. So, moreover, according to Hegel's philosophy, interpreted through a Platonic Jungian lens, obedience to laws based reasonably and transparently on that ultimate realization of the unity of nature and spirit in the idea transcends the antithesis between necessity and freedom, because obeying the archetypal laws written on the collective unconscious is tantamount to obeying one's deepest self. So in the footnote, I have a quote from Hegel talking about to obey the laws of a state based on realization of our unity with the absolute idea is freedom, because you're really only obeying your deepest self, and to obey yourself is to be free. Continuing here with the paper, for Hegel as for Plato, Jung, and Pauli, the ultimate method for attaining a liberating realization of the ideal unity of nature and spirit is by studying the mirror symmetry between them. So this is a huge point. AI can help us detect these mirror symmetries between mathematical physics of nature and the archetypal psychology of the psyche. Hegel explains even more specifically that we can gain self-realization and therefore freedom by studying the mirror symmetry between the gravity of matter and the freedom of spirit. So he draws a specific correlation between the gravity of matter and the freedom of spirit. Not a correlation. He says there's this mirror symmetry. And that will teach you about the nature of spirit. We're going to read it here. So that tactic led Hegel to define spirit in a way that correlates perfectly with the gravitational singularity collapsing into its own center in a black hole. As a partial preview of what we will examine more fully in section 2 of this paper, so I'm going to elaborate with subsequent papers. In Philosophy of History, Hegel says, here's the quote, "The nature of spirit may be understood by a glance at its direct opposite, matter. The essence of matter is gravity. The essence of spirit, its substance, is freedom. So, the nature of spirit may be understood by a glance at its direct opposite, matter." That's the mirror symmetry. You can understand yourself by looking at your mirror reflection. Left is right and right is left in a mirror. It's the opposite. Similarly, looking at the material world is like looking in a mirror for the psyche. It's a carbon copy, which is the perfect pun for the psyche. And then he says the essence of matter is gravity. The essence of spirit, its substance, is freedom. So freedom is the opposite of gravity. And I'll keep reading here to explain. He goes on to say that, quote, "Matter possesses gravity by virtue of its tendency toward a central point. It is essentially composite, consisting of parts that exclude each other. It seeks its unity and thereby its own abolition. It seeks its opposite. It strives toward ideality, for in unity it exists ideally." So again, matter possesses gravity by virtue of its tendency toward a central point. It is essentially composite, consisting of parts that exclude each other. It seeks its unity and thereby its own abolition. It seeks its opposite. It strives toward ideality, for in unity it exists ideally. So then I say, in review, first we learned that to learn about spirit, we should study its direct opposite, matter. Then we learned that the composite parts of matter strive gravitationally to destroy themselves by becoming their opposite, ideal unity in a central point outside themselves. The logic of the argument indicates that spirit, the opposite of matter, is the ideal unity, the central point outside matter, toward which the composite parts of matter strive gravitationally for their own abolition, which makes perfect sense if we identify spirit with the gravitational singularity in the center of a black hole into which all bits of matter that fall past the event horizon are drawn irresistibly. So it's a clear correlation between Hegel's description of spirit and the description of a gravitational singularity in the center of a black hole. So matter's drawn toward a center outside itself. All of the matter in the sun is drawn toward the center of the sun. All of the matter in the earth is drawn toward the center of the earth. But all of the planets, even though all of the material in each of those planets is drawn toward the center of that planet, all the planets are drawn toward the center of the solar system. So it's always seeking some center outside itself. That's the nature of matter. That's why it's not free. It's forced. It's compelled by gravity toward a center outside itself. And now we're going to go on to see spirit. It strives for the center that is itself, which helps to cement this correlation of the idea of spirit with the idea of a gravitational singularity in a black hole. All right, so matter, it strives for a center outside itself. It strives for its opposite, which is ideal unity. It wants to be all combined into one point. If it was to achieve that, it would abolish itself. It would become its opposite. But we learned at the beginning of this whole argument that spirit is the opposite of matter. Matter is the opposite of spirit. Gravity, the essence of matter, is the opposite of freedom, the essence of spirit. So if matter is pulled toward an ideal unity in which it wants to destroy itself, that equates ideal unity toward which matter is drawn and spirit. Now, continuing in the lectures on philosophy of history, that interpretation is furthermore consistent with what Hegel goes on to say next. So here's the quote. Here's his definition of spirit. Spirit, on the contrary, is that which has its center in itself. But this precisely is freedom. I am free when I am within myself. This self-contained existence of spirit is self-consciousness, consciousness of self. So matter is drawn by gravity toward a center outside itself. It seeks ideal unity and therefore its abolition Spirit is drawn toward the center that is itself, and that is its freedom. It's not dependent on something outside itself. Its goal is not outside itself. Its goal is within itself. And furthermore, that striving for its own center is self-consciousness. That is freedom. Freedom is self-consciousness. It's consciousness pulled back into itself, self-reflective consciousness, self-awareness. So he says, spirit, on the contrary, is that which has its center in itself, but that precisely is freedom. I am free when I am within myself. This self-contained existence of spirit is self-consciousness, consciousness of self. Then I say, in a different translation of the same key passage from Philosophy of History, Hegel includes the following revealing sentence. When the spirit strives towards its center, it strives to perfect its own freedom, and this striving is fundamental to its nature. So I say, the self-contained striving of spirit towards perfection in its own center is the essence or archetype of freedom, which is consciousness turned back into itself, i.e. self-consciousness, which correlates, I argue, to a point of infinite gravity collapsing into its own center at an infinite rate in the center of a black hole. Recall, moreover, how the interpretation of Hegel's definition of spirit is consistent with his earlier claim that spirit is the opposite of matter, the composite parts of which are pulled by the irresistible power of gravity toward an annihilating union with their opposite, ideal unity, in a central point outside themselves. So, perceived through the simplifying lens of a black hole mandala, the logic of Hegel's argument indicates that if we take gravity, which is the essence of matter, to its infinite extreme, we end up with its opposite, freedom, which is the essence of spirit. Spirit is a point of infinite gravity, striving for its own center at an infinite rate. Returning to the passage in question, Hegel concludes, following this abstract definition, it may be said that world history is the exhibition of spirit striving to attain knowledge of itself. I say, if each psyche is equivalent to a point of infinite gravity collapsing into its own center, as Jung's leap-day equation and Hegel's definition of spirit indicate, then world history is the exhibition of the human spirit striving to attain knowledge of the psyche equals singularity equation. All right, so let me just read that again. If each psyche is equivalent to a point of infinite gravity collapsing into its own center, as Jung's leap-day equation and Hegel's definition of spirit indicate, then world history is the exhibition of the human spirit striving to attain knowledge of the psyche equals singularity equation. That's why I said later it's a big boast to say that with the psyche equals singularity, we have achieved that level of history that Hegel predicted. It's the end of history. It's